What was the true foundation of Buck Owens's Bakersfield sound empire? Was it the money, the string of number one hits, or was it something far more fragile? What if the entire strength of the empire wasn't in a what, but in a who? A quiet genius named Don Rich? Was he really just a harmony singer, a right-hand man? Or was he the engine, the soul, the other half of the circuit that made the entire machine run? And what is the most devastating question of all? What happens when you bet an entire empire on a single heartbeat? Is it a work of genius or a blueprint for inevitable disaster? A desire that is intense isn't born from nothing. It was forged in the hard, unforgiving soil of Depression-era Texas. Alvis Edgar Owens Jr. was born on August 12, 1929 in the small city of Sherman. This was not a world of musical dreams. It was a world of pure survival. His father, Alvis Edgar Owens Sr., was a sharecropper, a man trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, working land he would never own. The family was poor, a poverty so profound it was almost elemental, like the wind and the dirt. The defining event of his childhood, the trauma that would forge his character, came in 1937. The Dust Bowl, a man-made ecological catastrophe, had turned the Great Plains into a barren wasteland. Massive dust storms called black blizzards swallowed homes and destroyed crops, turning once fertile farms into deserts. The Owens family, like hundreds of thousands of others, became refugees in their own country. They packed their meager belongings and joined the great westward migration of the Okies, a derogatory term for the displaced farmers from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and surrounding states. This was not a romantic journey. It was a desperate flight from starvation. They crammed onto a dilapidated 1933 Ford truck with other relatives, heading west on the fabled Route 66, a road of both hope and despair. The Dust Bowl did not just chase his family from Texas, it burned a lesson onto his young soul with the heat of a branding iron, that poverty was the cruelest tyrant of all. His lifelong obsessive drive for financial security was not just ambition. It was a declaration of war against the ghosts of his father's broken-down truck and the ever-present hunger of an empty horizon. The poverty was so severe that Buck's formal education was a casualty. He hated school, in part due to being bullied for a slight stutter, and felt the pressure to contribute to the family income. In 1942, at just 13, he dropped out of school to work full-time, picking cotton and corn under the blistering sun of the San Joaquin Valley, after the family eventually settled for a time in Mesa, Arizona. He was a man before he was a boy, his childhood sacrificed at the altar of his family's survival. It was during these years, after long days of backbreaking labor, that he found his escape in music. His mother Macy played the piano, and the family would often sing gospel hymns together. But it was the radio that opened up a whole new world. Through the crackle of the airwaves, he was captivated by the infectious, danceable rhythms of Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys. This was Western swing, a frenetic blend of country, blues, Dixieland jazz, and pop. And for a boy in the bleak landscape of the Depression, it was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He was mesmerized by the twin fiddles, the electric steel guitar, and the beat that made it impossible to sit still. It was dance music, honky-tonk music, an escape from the hardship of daily life. It was during this time that he acquired his nickname. One day, at just 3 or 4 years old, he announced that his name was Buck, after a mule on the family's farm. The name stuck. It seemed to fit, stubborn, strong, and unpretentious. As the war ended, opportunities began to open up. In 1945, at 16, he followed the trail of opportunity further west to a hot, dusty, blue-collar oil and farming town in California's Central Valley, Bakersfield. He had no idea he had just arrived in the town that he would one day transform into the new capital of country music, a defiant outpost to Nashville's dominance. In Bakersfield, he took any job he could find to make ends meet, driving trucks, digging ditches, working in the potato fields. But at night, he lived for the music. He acquired a Fender Telecaster, the guitar that would become iconic to his sound, and began playing in the loud, smoke-filled bars and honky-tonks of the town. Places like the Blackboard and the Lucky Spot were rough establishments where oil field workers and farmhands came to drink, dance, and sometimes fight. To be heard above the chaos, you had to play loud, hard, and direct. It was in this crucible that the Bakersfield sound began to form, and Buck Owens, the sharecropper's son, was right in the middle of it, soaking it all in and honing his craft, waiting for his moment. While Buck Owens was being forged in the heat and hardship of the Dust Bowl and the bars of Bakersfield, another story was beginning hundreds of miles to the north, in an entirely different world. Donald Eugene Ulrich, who the world would come to know as Don Rich, was born on August 15, 1941, in Olympia, Washington. The landscape here wasn't the sun-baked flatlands of Texas, but the lush, green, towering, and often rain-soaked forests of the Pacific Northwest. His family was also working class, but their world was one of relative stability and security. His father, a logger, worked a dangerous but steady job, and unlike the ever-moving Owens family, the Ulrichs were rooted. Like the Owens household, the Ulrichs were a musical family. His parents bought him a small fiddle when he was just 6 years old, and what happened next became the stuff of local legend. Don, by all accounts, was a prodigy. He was a quiet, shy boy who seemed to have been born with music flowing through his veins. He picked up the fiddle with an ease that was almost supernatural. He didn't require much formal instruction. The music just seemed to flow through him. He could hear a tune on the radio and play it back almost instantly. He soon added the guitar to his arsenal, his small fingers flying across the fretboard with astonishing speed and precision. While Buck Owens's musical education was a matter of grit and survival, learned in noisy bars, Don's was one of pure, joyful discovery, nurtured in a supportive family environment. He quickly surpassed his teachers. His talent was too obvious, too innate. He began performing publicly at a very young age, stunning audiences with his virtuosity. He could play the complex bluegrass breakdowns of Bill Monroe or the swinging Western melodies of Bob Wills with a confidence and sophistication that defied his years. But like Buck, he felt the sting of being an outsider. He, too, was bullied at school for his hillbilly accent and his love of country music, which was seen as unsophisticated and backward by many of his peers. This shared experience of being looked down upon for their rural roots would become a subtle but powerful point of connection between him and Buck years later. It instilled in both of them a sense that they had something to prove, that their music, the music of working people, was as valid and artistic as any other genre. By the time he was a teenager, he was already a seasoned professional. He played in local bands and soon landed a steady gig at a Tacoma venue called Steve's Gay 90s. It was here that he truly honed his skills. He wasn't just a fiddler, he was a complete musician. He developed his own unique electric guitar style, blending the precision of jazz with the raw power of early rock and roll. He also discovered he had a clear, high harmony voice, an instrument that would later become an indispensable part of the Buckaroos' sound. At Steve's Gay 90s, he learned how to please a crowd, how to read the mood of a room, and how to play with precision and energy night after night. He was a young man with a rare gift, a phenomenal talent looking for a bigger stage. He was quiet, unassuming, and completely dedicated to his music. He had no ambition to be a star. He simply wanted to play music at the highest level possible. He was waiting for the right partner, someone who could harness his talent and share it with the world. One was the engine, a force of raw, fiery ambition forged in the Texas dust. The other was the gyroscope, a prodigy of cool, perfect precision nurtured in the green Northwest. They were two separate, incomplete machines, hurtling through the American landscape on a collision course that would, miraculously, not result in destruction, but in the creation of a single, perfectly balanced, unstoppable engine of sound. Bakersfield, California, in the 1950s, was a town with a chip on its shoulder. It wasn't a place you visited. It was a place you ended up. A flat, sprawling, sun-scorched city in the southern end of the vast San Joaquin Valley. Its economy was fueled by two things: oil and agriculture. The black gold pumped from the ground, and the rich soil produced a rugged, blue-collar population of oilfield roughnecks, farm hands, and their families. Many of them were, like Buck Owens, refugees from the Dust Bowl, having brought their southern culture, their accents, and their music with them on the westward trek. The nights in Bakersfield were as hot as the days, and the social life revolved around a circuit of rowdy, cavernous bars known as honky-tonks. Places like the Blackboard, the Lucky Spot, and Trout's were not genteel listening rooms. They were loud, chaotic arenas filled with the sounds of clinking beer bottles, shouting, and the shuffling feet of dancers. This environment created a specific set of demands on a musician. To survive, let alone thrive, your music had to be loud enough to be heard over the din, rhythmic enough to keep people dancing and spending money, and emotionally direct enough to connect with a crowd that had little patience for subtlety. This was the crucible that forged the Bakersfield sound. While Nashville was moving towards a smoother, more pop-inflected style, the Nashville sound, characterized by lush string arrangements, polished backing vocals, and a sophisticated production style pioneered by producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, Bakersfield was heading in the opposite direction. It was a raw, stripped-down, and electrified rebellion. The sound was built on the foundation of the Fender Telecaster guitar, with its bright, cutting twang, played through powerful amplifiers turned up loud. It was anchored by a driving rock and roll influenced backbeat that emphasized the 2 and 4, making it perfect for dancing. It was music born of necessity, crafted to conquer the noise of the barroom. By the late 1950s, Buck Owens was the undisputed king of this burgeoning scene. His journey had not been easy. After arriving in Bakersfield, he hustled relentlessly. He worked as a session guitarist at the local Capitol Records studio, playing on records for other artists, most notably on several hits for Tommy Collins, like You Better Not Do That. He learned the mechanics of making a record, absorbing everything he could about arranging, songwriting, and studio technique. He even had his own early recordings for Capitol, but they failed to capture the raw energy of his live performances. The label tried to mold him into a rockabilly singer, a smoother country crooner, but nothing stuck. Frustrated, Buck felt his unique voice was being diluted. He temporarily moved his family to the Tacoma, Washington area in 1958. Not to escape the Bakersfield scene, but to find a new angle on it. He bought a stake in a radio station, KAYE, and hosted his own show. This move gave him a crucial perspective from outside the Bakersfield bubble. It allowed him to see what was unique about the music he had been making, and it hardened his resolve to do things his own way. It was during this time that he cemented his musical identity. He knew he wanted a sound that was direct, powerful, and unapologetically country. He had the songs, he had the ambition, and he was the magnetic center of the stage. But he knew, with an instinct that bordered on obsession, that something was missing. He was searching for a musical partner, a right arm, someone who not only understood his vision, but could elevate it, complete it. He needed another piece of his own soul, and as fate would have it, he would find it just a few miles from his new home in Washington State. The year was 1959. Buck Owens, already a seasoned veteran of the West Coast music scene at age 30, was on a brief tour, playing the circuit of clubs and dance halls he knew so well. One night, a booking took him to Steve's Gay 90s restaurant in Tacoma. It was an unassuming venue, but it was known for featuring talented local musicians. And that night on the small stage, Buck saw a 17-year-old kid named Don Ulrich playing the fiddle. It was a moment of pure musical revelation. For Buck, it was like a lightning strike. In the young fiddler's playing, he didn't just hear technical brilliance, though that was present in spades. Don played with a fire and a soulful precision that was astonishing for his age. He could shift from a mournful ballad to a blistering hoedown without missing a beat. But what truly captivated Buck was something deeper. He heard a kindred spirit. He heard the missing piece of the puzzle he had been trying to solve in his head for years. He heard the soaring melodic counterpoint to his own rhythmic, aggressive guitar playing. He saw a quiet, focused professionalism that contrasted with his own charismatic showmanship. After the set, Buck, never one to waste time, immediately approached the young prodigy. He introduced himself, and with his characteristic directness, invited Don to join his band and move down to Bakersfield. For Don, a quiet teenager still living with his parents, the offer was staggering. Buck Owens was a recording artist, a figure from the world of radio and records. It was an opportunity to leave the local circuit and step onto a national stage. Despite his youth, Don recognized the gravity of the moment. He agreed. Don's arrival in Bakersfield was the final crucial ingredient in a formula that was about to explode. Buck didn't just hire a fiddler. He found his musical other half. Don moved in with Buck's family for a time, and the two became inseparable. It was in the rehearsal rooms and on the stages of the Bakersfield honky-tonks that they forged one of the most symbiotic partnerships in music history. Buck encouraged Don to change his last name from Ulrich to Rich, a simpler, more memorable stage name. And with that, Don Rich was born, and the foundation for the Buckaroos was laid. The musical chemistry between Buck Owens and Don Rich was immediate and explosive. It was an alchemy that transformed both of them. In Don, Buck found the perfect musical foil. Don wasn't just a phenomenal fiddler. He was a multi-instrumentalist who could also play a blistering lead guitar, often trading licks with Buck on their twin Telecasters. More importantly, he possessed a high, pure harmony voice that was the perfect complement to Buck's rougher, more emotional lead. Their harmony was a conversation between two halves of a single soul. Buck's voice was the raw, earthy ground full of heartbreak and Texas grit. Don's voice was the high, lonesome sky, a pure, piercing tenor that provided the hope and the heartbreak in equal measure. It was the sound of a man walking on the ground, staring up at a star he could never quite reach. It was a sound they worked on relentlessly, practicing for hours to get the phrasing and the notes perfectly locked together. This vocal blend gave their records an electrifying edge, a sense of urgency, and high, lonesome tension that was utterly unique. On stage, their connection was almost telepathic. Buck was the frontman, the master of ceremonies, but Don was the musical anchor. Their communication was a thing of beauty, a series of subtle nods, glances, and smiles that only they understood. Buck would kick off a song, and Don would instinctively know where to go, whether to launch into a fiery fiddle solo or a stinging guitar break. Don became, in effect, the band's musical director. He arranged the harmonies, polished the instrumental parts, and maintained a level of musical discipline that allowed Buck the freedom to be the charismatic entertainer. They officially formed the Buckaroos, a band that would become one of the most iconic in country music history, featuring a rotating cast of brilliant musicians like Doyle Holly on bass, Willie Cantu on drums, and Tom Brumley on the pedal steel guitar. Together, they refined their sound into a perfectly calibrated machine. It was a revolution, a direct, intentional rebellion against the Nashville sound. It was built on Buck's driving rhythm Telecaster, Don's soaring fiddle and harmonies, a powerful rock and roll influenced backbeat, and Brumley's weeping steel guitar. It was raw, exciting, completely undeniable, and ready to take on the world. The early 1960s saw the newly minted Buckaroos honing their sound and building a massive following on the West Coast. In 1963, they released a song that would change everything. The song was Act Naturally, a charming, self-deprecating tune about a guy who's so good at being sad and lonely, they're going to put him in the movies. The record was a perfect distillation of the Bakersfield sound. It kicked off with a simple, catchy guitar riff driven by a relentless beat and topped with the signature Buck and Don harmony. Act Naturally shot to #1 on the country charts and stayed there for 4 weeks. It was more than just a hit. It was a declaration of independence. It was a sound so fresh and vital that it couldn't be ignored. It was the shot heard round Nashville. The establishment, which had largely dismissed the West Coast scene as a regional novelty, was forced to pay attention. The floodgates open. The period from 1963 to 1966 was their golden age, an almost unbelievable run of commercial and artistic success. They were a hit-making machine, racking up an astonishing 15 #1 hits. Songs like Love's Gonna Live Here, which spent an incredible 16 weeks at the top of the charts, My Heart Skips a Beat, Together Again, and I've Got a Tiger by the Tail were not just hits, they were anthems, defining the sound of a new, more aggressive brand of country music for a generation. Their sound even crossed the Atlantic. In 1965, the biggest band in the world, the Beatles, recorded their own version of Act Naturally, with Ringo Starr on lead vocals, for their album Help. It was a stunning testament to the global reach and universal appeal of the sound Buck and Don had forged in the dusty bars of Bakersfield. They were no longer just a West Coast phenomenon, they were international stars. Buck Owens and the Buckaroos had arrived, and the world of country music would never be the same. With their sound now conquering the airwaves and their names known across the nation, Buck and Don had ignited a revolution. But building an army is one thing, ruling an empire is another. The years that followed would test their bond not with the struggle for success, but with the immense crushing weight of it. With a string of #1 hits solidifying their status as country music royalty, Buck Owens's ambition shifted into a higher gear. The deep-seated fear of poverty, the ghost of his family's flight from the Dust Bowl, had never left him. Chart success was wonderful, but it was also fickle. He was determined to build something more tangible, something that couldn't be taken away when the hits stopped coming. He set out to build an empire, and he did it with the same relentless drive and shrewd instinct that he applied to his music. The first pillar of this empire was television. In 1966, they launched their own syndicated television program, The Buck Owens Ranch Show. Filmed in vibrant color, the show was a half-hour distillation of the Buckaroos' live energy. It was fast-paced, unpretentious, and filled with music. Unlike the more formal and staid country music shows of the era, the ranch show was loose and fun. Buck was a natural host, his charisma and easygoing humor translating perfectly to the small screen. The show featured the full band, with special spotlights on Don's fiddling or Tom Brumley's pedal steel wizardry, and performances of their latest hits alongside country classics. It was broadcast in over 100 markets across the country, turning Buck Owens and the Buckaroos from radio stars into household names and faces. It was a brilliant marketing tool, selling records and concert tickets while Buck got paid for the privilege. But Buck's business acumen went far beyond television. Remembering the paltry songwriting royalties he'd received early in his career, he founded his own music publishing company, Blue Book Music. This move was revolutionary for an artist at the time. By owning the publishing rights to his own songs and signing other songwriters to his company, he ensured that he, not a New York or Nashville corporation, would profit every time one of his songs was played on the radio, sold on a record, or performed by another artist. It was a move of incredible foresight that generated immense wealth and gave him complete creative control. He didn't stop there. He began buying up radio stations, starting with local station KUZZ in Bakersfield, which he transformed into a country music powerhouse. He later acquired others, creating a small but profitable network. He invested in real estate. He opened a booking agency to manage his own tours and those of other artists. He even put his name on a line of Buck Owens signature guitars from the Mosrite Company. He did not build a business empire. He built a fortress. Every radio station, every publishing company, every piece of real estate was another stone in the wall he was constructing around himself, a fortification designed to keep the ghost of his father's broken-down Ford truck from ever reaching him again. The sharecropper's son had built his own kingdom brick by brick. The engine that powered this entire empire was the band itself. The Buckaroos were, above all else, a working band. Their schedule was relentless and punishing. They toured the United States from coast to coast, playing everything from sold-out arenas and prestigious venues like Carnegie Hall to state fairs and honky-tonks. They then flew across the globe, undertaking massively successful tours in Japan, Australia, and Europe, where their raw, energetic sound was embraced with a fervor that surprised even them. Life on the road was a blur of highways, airports, hotel rooms, and stage lights. It was a life of exhilarating highs and crushing lows. The highs were the 2 hours on stage each night where the magic happened. The band was a finely tuned machine, a unit so tight and rehearsed that they could turn on a dime, following Buck's every subtle cue. Their live shows were legendary displays of showmanship and musical virtuosity. But the grind was immense. The endless travel, the lack of sleep, the pressure to deliver a perfect show every single night, it began to take a toll. For Don Rich in particular, the constant pressure was a heavy burden. As the band's musical director and Buck's indispensable right-hand man, a huge amount of responsibility fell on his shoulders. He was the one who had to ensure the band was always sharp, the harmonies were always perfect, and the music never faltered. He was naturally a quiet and private person, and the demands of constant public life were a strain. To cope with the stress, the loneliness, and the physical exhaustion, he began to drink more heavily. It was a habit he managed to keep largely hidden from the public and even from Buck for a long time. On the outside, he was the consummate professional, always ready to play. But behind the quiet smile, a private struggle was unfolding. The road that was leading them to worldwide fame was also a lonely and difficult path, and the seeds of future tragedy were being sown in the shadows of the spotlight. Perhaps no single event better encapsulated the peak of the Buckaroos' power and influence than their concert at New York's Carnegie Hall on March 25, 1966. For a country band from Bakersfield playing Carnegie Hall, the hallowed ground of classical music and sophisticated jazz, was the equivalent of planting a flag on conquered territory. It was a symbolic validation of their music, a statement that the Bakersfield sound belonged on the world's most prestigious stages. They didn't water down their sound for the New York City audience. They did the exact opposite. They unleashed a full-force Bakersfield assault. The live album recorded that night, Carnegie Hall Concert, is a masterpiece, capturing a band at the absolute zenith of its powers. The energy is electric from the first note. Buck is in total command, a master showman working the crowd. The band is a razor-sharp unit, playing with a precision and drive that is breathtaking. The album is a showcase for every member, but it is Don Rich who shines brightest. His fiddle playing on Orange Blossom Special is a jaw-dropping display of speed and melodic invention. His guitar work is crisp and stinging, and his harmony vocals are the glue that holds everything together, soaring above the music with that iconic, high lonesome purity. The recording proved what their fans already knew. This was not just a great country band. This was one of the greatest live bands in American music, period. They had taken the raw, rowdy sound of the honky-tonks and elevated it to the level of high art, all without sacrificing an ounce of its authenticity or power. As the 1960s bled into the early 1970s, the musical landscape began to change. The slick Nashville sound, which Buck had rebelled against, was itself being challenged by a new wave of outlaw artists like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. Rock music had grown heavier and more complex. While the Buckaroos remained a huge concert draw, their dominance of the radio charts began to wane. After 1969's Tall Dark Stranger, their number one hits became less frequent. The pressure to stay relevant was immense. Buck, ever the savvy entertainer, found a new and even larger audience as the co-host of the country-themed comedy show Hee Haw, which premiered in 1969. The show was a massive mainstream success, making Buck Owens an even bigger television star than he already was. But for many of his hardcore fans, it felt like a compromise. The sharp-edged, rebellious tiger of the 60s was now telling corny jokes in a cornfield set. Behind the scenes, the relentless pace of the past decade had left its mark. The band members were tired. Don Rich, now in his early 30s, expressed a desire to leave the road and pursue his own projects, perhaps producing records for other artists. He had given his entire adult life to Buck's vision. While their personal bond remained as strong as ever, the professional dynamic was subtly shifting. The empire was secure, their legacy was assured. They seemed invincible, a permanent fixture in the country music firmament. But the world was changing around them, and a sense of unease was beginning to creep in. At the edges of the Golden Kingdom, the Golden Age had reached its peak. The empire was secure, the legacy assured. From the outside, they were invincible. But the relentless pace had created hairline fractures beneath the surface, and as the cultural tides of the 1970s began to shift, a shadow was falling over the kingdom, a silence waiting to descend with a devastating finality that no one could have foreseen. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, Buck Owens found himself in a peculiar and paradoxical position. He was, by any measure, more famous than ever before. This fame, however, came from a source that seemed worlds away from the gritty honky-tonks of Bakersfield. In 1969, he and fellow country artist Roy Clark became the co-hosts of a new country variety television show called Hee Haw. Initially dismissed by network executives as too rural and unsophisticated, Hee Haw was an instant runaway success. It was a whirlwind of cornpone humor, musical performances, and recurring skits set in the fictional Cornfield County. Buck, with his natural comedic timing and wide grin, became the face of the show, picking and grinning and delivering punchlines from behind a bale of hay. The show brought country music and Buck Owens into millions of American living rooms every week. It was a television institution, and it made Buck a bona fide superstar, beloved by a vast mainstream audience that may never have set foot in a honky-tonk. For Buck, the show was the ultimate realization of his lifelong quest for financial security. It provided a steady, enormous income and a level of fame that insulated him from the shifting winds of the music charts. It was also a way to keep his band, the Buckaroos, employed and on a national stage. But this success came at a significant artistic cost. To the music critics and the more serious country music aficionados, Hee Haw felt like a betrayal of the very rebellion Buck had once championed. The raw, defiant innovator who had challenged the Nashville establishment was now seen as a country caricature, a willing participant in the kind of down-home parody that sophisticated listeners often disdained. It became a gilded cage. While the show provided security, it also began to overshadow his musical legacy. The band's recording output during this period often felt less urgent, more polished, and sometimes catered to the broader, more conservative audience of the show. The tiger, it seemed to some, had been tamed and turned into a television personality. Don Rich and the other Buckaroos were featured on the show, of course, their musical talents on full display, but they were also players in the larger comedy machine. For a musician as serious and dedicated as Don, the repetitive nature of television and the often silly context must have been a stark contrast to the pure, electric thrill of their live concerts during the golden years. The paradox was complete. At the peak of his fame, Buck Owens was in danger of losing the very musical credibility he had fought so hard to build. Despite the demands of television and the shifting musical landscape, the Buckaroos remained a formidable force as a live act. On stage, away from the Cornfield County set, the magic was still there. They were seasoned professionals, a unit that breathed and moved as one. Their concerts were still masterclasses in country music, and their tours, particularly overseas, were still incredibly successful. They were elder statesmen of the Bakersfield sound, their legacy already secure. During this period, Don Rich began to look toward a future beyond the endless cycle of touring. He had spent his entire adult life as Buck's right-hand man, and while their bond was unbreakable, he began to nurture ambitions of his own. He developed a keen interest in music production, demonstrating a sharp ear and a natural talent for working with other artists in the studio. He produced records for artists on Buck's label, including Buck's own son, Buddy Allen. It was a role that suited his quiet, meticulous nature perfectly. He also found a new passion that gave him a sense of freedom and escape from the pressures of the road, motorcycles. He became an avid rider, and the powerful machine became his sanctuary. On the open roads of the California coast, he wasn't Don Rich, the famous sideman. He was just a man on his bike, feeling the wind and the sun. It was a solitary pursuit, a world away from the noise of the crowds and the confines of a tour bus. Buck was aware of Don's growing restlessness and his desire to spend more time at home with his family and in the recording studio. There was an understanding that eventually Don would transition away from the grueling demands of full-time touring. But there was no urgency. They were still a team, still making music, still on top of the world. They had built an empire together, and it felt as though it would stand forever. The bond forged over 15 years of shared stages and private struggles seemed eternal. They couldn't imagine a world in which they weren't standing shoulder to shoulder, making music together. And then came July 17th, 1974. It was a rare day off for the band. Don Rich, now 32 years old, was at his home in San Luis Obispo. The weather was perfect for a ride. He had recently bought a new motorcycle, a Harley-Davidson Sportster, and he was eager to take it out on the scenic coastal highways. He planned to meet his wife and some friends for dinner later that evening in Morro Bay. He headed north on Highway 1, the iconic ribbon of asphalt that hugs the dramatic cliffs of the California coast. The details of what happened next are tragically simple and brutally final. According to the California Highway Patrol report, he was traveling at a high rate of speed. As he approached a sharp curve near the Morro Bay State Park entrance, he lost control. The motorcycle hit a center divider and Don was thrown from the bike. He died instantly. There were no other vehicles involved. There was no one else to blame. It was just a man, his machine, and a fatal solitary moment in time. The news was relayed to a highway patrol dispatcher and then to the local authorities. The call had to be made to Buck Owens. When the phone rang, Buck was at his office in Bakersfield, planning the next phase of their career. The voice on the other end of the line delivered a message that was so incomprehensible, so world-shattering, that it didn't seem real. Don was gone. The words hung in the air, an impossible, horrifying fact. The shockwave radiated outwards, first through the band, then through the tight-knit Bakersfield community, and finally through the entire country music world. For Buck Owens, it was not the loss of a friend. It was an amputation of the soul. The shadow that gave the tiger its shape was gone. The high, lonesome harmony that gave his own voice its meaning was silenced. The right arm of his entire existence had been severed, and all that was left was a phantom limb, an ache that would never go away. In the aftermath, Buck Owens was a broken man. His grief was profound and all-consuming. At a tribute concert held shortly after the accident, a heartbroken Buck stood before the crowd and tried to put his loss into words. He was like a brother, a son, and a best friend. He said, his voice thick with emotion, something I've never said before, but I'm sure you all know. He was the best friend I ever had. He tried to carry on. He hired other musicians, some of the best in the business, to try and fill the void Don had left. But it was impossible. The magic was gone. The telepathic connection, the perfect harmony, it could not be replicated. Don wasn't just a fiddle player or a guitarist. He was the other half of Buck's musical soul. Every time Buck stepped on stage and looked to his right, Don wasn't there. Every time he sang a chorus and reached for that high harmony, only silence answered. The music, once a source of immense joy and his life's driving purpose, now became a source of unbearable pain. Every song was a memory. Every chord change was a ghost. He spiraled into a deep depression, retreating from the public eye. He continued his contractual obligations with hee-haw, the smile on his face now a painful mask. But the musician inside him had died. The fire was out. In a move that shocked the music industry at the height of his power and fame, Buck Owens quietly walked away from his recording career and from performing live. The king of Bakersfield had abdicated his throne. The sound that had conquered the world had been silenced, and for Buck Owens, a long, quiet winter was about to begin. The music had died. For a decade, the tiger remained in a self-imposed exile, the silence of his grief as loud as his music once was. The world moved on, and a legend faded into a television memory. But in the heart of a new generation, the echo of that Bakersfield twang refused to die, and a faithful disciple was about to make a pilgrimage to awaken the sleeping king. The years immediately following Don Rich's death were a long, hollow echo. For the world, a great musician was gone. For Buck Owens, the world itself had lost its color and its sound. He was consumed by a grief so profound it bordered on a living death. It was a complicated grief, tangled with a crushing sense of guilt. He reportedly tortured himself with unanswerable questions. Should he have discouraged Don's love for motorcycles? Was there something he could have said or done differently that fateful day? The rational mind knew it was a tragic accident, but the grieving heart searched for a reason, a way to make sense of the senseless. He retreated from the world of music, the one place he had always called home. He disbanded the classic lineup of the Buckaroos. Without Don as the anchor, the telepathic center, the band was just a collection of talented musicians, not the singular entity it had once been. The heart had been ripped out and the body could no longer function. He fulfilled his contractual recording obligations to Capitol Records, but the sessions were joyless, the output uninspired. His heart was no longer in it. His final top 10 hit of that era came in 1975. After that, his presence on the country charts faded into silence. The most jarring aspect of this period was the stark duality of his life. While the musician Buck Owens had vanished, the television personality Buck Owens remained. Every week he appeared on Hee Haw, smiling, singing, and trading one-liners with Roy Clark. The grin that had once been a natural expression of his boundless charisma now became a mask. He was a king in exile, living out his reign in a gilded cage made of plywood cornstalks. He was surrounded by the noise and laughter of a television studio, but inside, he was living in a profound silence. The show that had once been a pillar of his empire now became his prison, a contractual obligation that forced him to perform joy when all he felt was pain. He was one of the most famous entertainers in America, and arguably one of the loneliest. The remainder of the 1970s and the early 1980s constituted Buck's long winter. While his businesses, the radio stations, the publishing company, the real estate holdings thrived under his astute management, the artist remained dormant. He had achieved the financial security he had craved since his childhood days in the Dust Bowl, but he had lost the creative spark that had been his true salvation. During this decade, the sound of country music continued to evolve, moving even further away from the raw twang of Bakersfield. The outlaw movement gave way to the slick, pop-infused urban cowboy era of the early 80s, a time of rhinestone cowboys and polished productions that were the antithesis of everything Buck Owens had once stood for. To a new generation of country fans, Buck Owens wasn't a revolutionary. He was the friendly, corny guy from Hee Haw. His groundbreaking records of the 1960s were becoming historical artifacts, admired by purists but largely absent from the contemporary conversation. The king was in his castle, counting his money, while the kingdom of music he had once ruled had moved on. He rarely performed live. When he did, it was often out of obligation, and the fire was gone. He had built a wall around himself, a fortress of financial success and public affability that protected the broken man inside. He was a living legend who had become a museum piece in his own lifetime. The tiger was sleeping, and there was no one, it seemed, who could wake him. Then, in the mid-1980s, a rebellion began to stir. A new generation of artists who had grown up listening to the classic records of their parents began to reject the slick pop sheen that had come to dominate country radio. They were called the neo-traditionalists, and they looked back to the roots of country music, to the honky-tonk of Hank Williams, the western swing of Bob Wills, and the raw electric twang of Buck Owens for their inspiration. At the forefront of this movement was a young, fiercely intense singer-songwriter from Kentucky named Dwight Yoakam. Yoakam was more than just a fan of Buck Owens. He was a true disciple. He had moved to Los Angeles, not Nashville, to pursue his career, deliberately choosing the West Coast to be closer to the spirit of the music he loved. His sound was a potent, modern cocktail of hardcore, honky-tonk, rockabilly swagger, and the unmistakable driving guitar sound of the Bakersfield scene. In interview after interview, as his own star began to rise, Yoakum preached the gospel of Buck Owens. Yoakum made it his mission to remind the world of the innovator behind the television personality, framing Buck as a true American original, a revolutionary on par with Johnny Cash or Merle Haggard. To a younger audience who only knew the TV star, Yoakum reintroduced the innovator, the hitmaker, the rebel. He was a musical archaeologist, dusting off the legacy of his hero and presenting it to the world once more, shining and new. He was sending out a call, a musical signal to the sleeping king, whether he knew it or not. In 1987, Dwight Yoakam, now a bona fide country star with a string of critically acclaimed hits, decided to make the call directly. He wanted to record a duet with his hero. His choice of song was perfect, Streets of Bakersfield, an evocative tune about the town's rough-and-tumble identity, originally recorded by Buck as an album track in 1973. Initially, Buck was hesitant, almost dismissive. He was done with the music business. He was convinced his voice was shot and that no one cared to hear from him anymore. He had been living in the quiet for so long that the thought of stepping back into the noise of a recording studio was terrifying. But Yoakum was persistent. He was driven by a genuine reverence and a belief that the world needed to hear Buck's voice again. Finally, Buck agreed. The recording session was a revelation. Prodded by Yoakum's infectious energy and the raw power of the band, something inside Buck reawakened. As they stood side by side at the microphone trading verses, the old fire began to burn again. When the record was finished, it was a glorious twang-filled masterpiece, a bridge between two generations of the Bakersfield sound, supercharged with a Mexican-style accordion riff from Flaco Jimenez that gave it an irresistible energy. Released in 1988, Streets of Bakersfield was a massive, unexpected hit. It shot to #1 on the Billboard country chart, Buck's first chart topper in 16 years. The accompanying music video, which featured Buck and Dwight cruising through Bakersfield in a Cadillac, was in heavy rotation on CMT. The comeback was complete. It was not just a hit record, it was an echo that became a roar. For over a decade, the canyon of country music had been filled with a profound silence where Buck Owens' voice used to be. And now, a faithful disciple had shouted his hero's name into that canyon, and a miracle had happened. A voice had answered back. Resurrected by the call of a new generation, Buck Owens was pulled back from the brink. The winter was over, but this final chapter would not be a chase for past glories. Instead, it would be a homecoming, a time to build a final monument, make peace with the ghosts of the past, and cement a legacy, not just in the record books, but in the very heart of the town that started it all. The astonishing success of Streets of Bakersfield did more than just put Buck Owens back on the charts. It reconnected him with his own legacy and, most importantly, with the joy of making music. The duet's triumph had flung open a door he thought was locked forever. But instead of chasing that success by hitting the road again or diving headfirst into the modern Nashville music machine, Buck did something far more profound. He decided to bring the mountain to him. He channeled his renewed energy and considerable resources into creating a final, lasting monument to the sound, the town, and the life he had built. He envisioned a place in Bakersfield that would be a combination of a world-class concert venue, a museum, and a top-notch restaurant and bar. It would be his personal Grand Ole Opry, a temple dedicated to the Bakersfield sound. For years, he meticulously planned every detail, sketching designs on napkins, overseeing construction, and pouring his heart into the project. In 1996, the Buck Owens' Crystal Palace opened its doors. It was a stunning achievement, a lavish Western-themed edifice rising from the dusty flats of Bakersfield. It was everything he had envisioned and more. A state-of-the-art music hall with superb acoustics, walls adorned with memorabilia from his legendary career, nudie suits, vintage guitars, gold records, and a menu featuring his favorite chicken fried steak. It was not just a business venture, it was a home. It was a place where his music could live and breathe on his own terms for his own people. The Crystal Palace was the ultimate symbol of his journey. The sharecropper's son, who had once fled the dust, now had his own palace built on the very ground that had defined him. The opening of the Crystal Palace marked the final peaceful chapter of Buck Owens' life. He had come full circle. The relentless ambition that had driven him for decades softened into a comfortable sense of purpose. He was no longer the hungry tiger chasing #1 hits. He was now the benevolent keeper of the flame. His routine settled into a comfortable rhythm. Most weekends, he would perform at the palace with his band, a new iteration of the Buckaroos. He wasn't touring the world anymore. The world now came to Bakersfield to see him. These were not the high-pressure make-or-break shows of his youth. They were joyous celebrations of the music he loved, performed for an adoring audience of old fans and new converts. He would tell stories, crack jokes, and sing the songs that had become the soundtrack to so many lives. The haunted look that had shadowed him for years was replaced by a genuine, easy contentment. In 1996, the same year the palace opened, he received country music's highest honor, induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was the official acknowledgement of his status as one of the genre's true architects. He stood on the stage in Nashville, the city he had once so defiantly challenged, and accepted his place in the pantheon. He had outlasted his critics, outlived his pain, and had finally found peace with his own monumental legacy. The long winter was a distant memory, and the king was home, secure on his throne. March 25, 2006 started like any other Saturday. Buck, now 76, was scheduled to perform his regular show at the Crystal Palace. But he wasn't feeling well. He had been feeling ill for some time, and that day he felt particularly weak. He told his band and his family that he was going to cancel the show. He just didn't have the strength. As he was getting ready to leave the palace, he saw a family at a table. They had, he learned, driven all the way from Oregon just to see him perform. The story struck a deep chord with the old showman. For his entire life, he had lived by a simple code. You don't let the audience down. The people who paid their hard-earned money to see you deserved your best. Seeing that family, their hopeful faces, their long journey, it changed his mind. He famously said, well, if they're hungry, I'll just have my favorite meal, a chicken fried steak, and I'll go on and do the show. And that's exactly what he did. He walked out on that stage, strapped on his red, white, and blue Telecaster, and gave it his all one last time. He played the hits, told the stories, and sang with a spirit that defied his age and his ailing health. After the final encore, he waved goodbye to the cheering crowd, went home, and passed away peacefully in his sleep just a few hours later. It was the end that every true performer secretly wishes for, to leave this world having just emptied the tank on stage, the applause still echoing in the air. The legacy of Buck Owens is immense and undeniable. He was a true original, an artist who bent the music world to his will, not the other way around. He challenged the Nashville establishment and created a sound that was raw, exciting, and deeply authentic. He was a visionary songwriter, a charismatic performer, and a brilliant businessman who built an empire from nothing. He left behind a towering catalog of 21 #1 hits and a sound that continues to influence artists to this day. But the story of Buck Owens cannot and must not be told without the story of Don Rich. Theirs was a partnership that transcended the typical roles of bandleader and sideman. They were two halves of a whole, two sides of the same musical coin. The Bakersfield sound was not the creation of one man, it was the product of their unique and powerful alchemy. Buck was the engine and the chassis, but Don was the high-octane fuel and the lightning bolt design. Don Rich was more than the greatest sideman in country music history. He was the indispensable other half of a musical soul. His tragic early death didn't just end a career, it silenced a sound. Buck Owens lived for another 32 years. He found a second act, he found peace, and he died a beloved icon. But in a very real artistic sense, a part of him died on that highway too. Their story is a powerful, poignant reminder that some harmonies are so perfect, so rare, and so fragile that once they are broken, they can never truly be replaced. Buck was the clenched, aggressive fist of the Bakersfield sound, but Don was the steady, faithful heartbeat that gave that fist its lifeblood. The music they made was the sound of a single, perfect punch, and its beautiful, brutal impact will echo forever.